without further ado, we'll get started with the substantive of the debate. So opening the case for side proposition is Robert Verkeek. Robert Verkeek is an author and journalist, having written for the Sunday Telegraph, Sunday Times, Mail on Sunday, Independent, and Independent on Sunday. His most recent book, Posh Boys, How English Public Schools Ruined Britain, was released in 2018. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I would like to begin by asking you all a question. Did any of you, by any chance, go to school? The reason I'm asking that question is because that's the question that Etonians ask of other Etonians when they're seeking to establish whether they went to the same school. So obviously, if you say yes, then you get a great big hug. If you say no, why you asked me such a stupid question, you obviously went to Harrow or some other inferior institution. The point is that for Etonians, there is only one school. What is Eton? What is Eton College? Well, there are lots of myths about Eton, which have grown up over the years. I'd like to explode a few straight away. Eton is not a small secondary school set in the middle of the Berkshire countryside, educating children from the local villages, although in 1440, when it was first established, that was exactly what Eton was intended. It was intended for the education of 70 poor and indigent scholars. Neither is Eton, despite what many historians claim, is a school that helped build the British Empire. The Battle of Waterloo was not won on the playing fields of Eton. In 1815, there were no playing fields at Eton. And neither did the Duke of Wellington attribute his famous victory to his short time at the school. In fact, Wellington acquired his military prowess in France, not England, at an academy in Angers. So it would be more accurate to say that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Angers. Neither is Eton a school that opens its doors to the local community. Eton now employs a former head of counter-terrorism to stop the hoi polloi from trespassing on its hallowed turf. Eton is in fact, or Eton Town is in fact, a vassal community, enslaved to the commercial interests of the school, whose dormitory dames march the young boys up and down the high street once a term, equipping them with their expensive clobber. Shops that in Eton that don't get on or are not on good terms with the school tend to go out of business very quickly. So by nationalising Eton, we would be liberating a whole town, imagine. Neither is Eton much beloved of its alumni, as far as I can tell. The poet Percy Shelley attended the school in the 1700s. He was so tormented by the school that he tried to blow it up during a science lesson. George Orwell, who was very badly bullied when he was at Eton. In 1940, when he wrote his seminal treatise, The Lion and the Unicorn, he recommended that public school autonomy should be abolished in this country. And more recently, the Homeland actor Damian Lewis, he said he found the experience of Eton so violent that he will not be troubling the school with his own son's education. In fact, the only two people who seem to have enjoyed their time at Eton are Boris Johnson, obviously, and one of your lot, Cambridge spy Guy Burgess, who spent most of his time in exile in Moscow sporting the old Etonian tie. That does not mean, of course, that Eton or any of its alumni have not had a profoundly damaging influence on the national character and interest of this country. Take Brexit, for example. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are for leave or for remain, but you can quite comfortably describe the farce of Brexit by referring to people who went to Eton. And you can begin with Jimmy Goldsmith, who founded the Referendum Party in the 1990s, through to David Cameron, obviously called the referendum in 2016, to his old schoolmate Boris, who switched sides and gave Leave that crucial momentum. Even the data analytics company, Cambridge Analytica, even that, which used social media to swing the Brexit vote, even that was founded by two Etonian brothers. Eton hasn't seemed to have changed very much since our last serious national crisis, 1956, Suez, when the headmaster of Eton described Suez as a national triumph for the school, because although Anthony Eden, an old Etonian, got us into that terrible mess, it was the Etonian cabinet that got us out. Eton today remains a monument to testosterone-charged privilege. It is an affront to the sense of English fairness. It has strayed very far from its original charitable statutes. It is a charity by name only. And it would be easy for us to take our trusty swords and of righteous indignation and chop the school down. But of course, Eton would only replant itself in some other unsuspecting part of the country, because Eton is symbolic of a apartheid two-tier education system in this country, which means that children are divided into winners and losers purely on the basis of the size of their parents' bank account. So if we want to nationalise Eton, we must also nationalise all our public schools, because only in that way will we solve the problem. Nationalising Eton and bringing Eton into the mainstream education system would mean that we would acquire some fantastic resources. It's got a £400 million endowment for starters. We would be able to take their huge classrooms, their state-of-the-art laboratories, their West End-sized theatres, and of course those vast, empty playing fields. And instead of using them for the benefit of the already privileged and lucky few, we could give them to disadvantaged children, children in care, children from broken homes, children with serious disabilities, or children with learning difficulties. We could turn Eton into a special school, a school that the whole country would feel proud of. But I'm warning you, it's been done or tried before and failed. And the last time it was seriously considered, apart from Corbyn opposition now, was in 1982 when Neil Kinnock was Labour spokesman for education. And Eton was so rattled that, because Labour wanted to turn it into a comprehensive, that they commissioned their star columnist, the Eton Chronicle, the in-house magazine of the school, to write a riposte to this idea that Eton would become a comprehensive. That star writer's name was Boris Johnson. And I have an exclusive for you this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have tracked down that very speech from 1982. I went into the Eton Chronicle archives and I found it. If you don't mind, I would like to crave your indulgence and read it to you, or part of it. So it begins. I tell you this. Apologies for the Boris impersonation. I tell you this, the civilized world must ignore entirely those idiots who tell us that by their very existence, the public schools demolish all hopes most cherished for the comprehensive system. Clearly this is twaddle, utter bunkum, balderdash, tommy-rot, piffle, and fiddlesticks of the most insidious kind. So strain every nerve, parents of Britain, to send your son to this educational establishment. Exercise your freedom of choice, because in this way you will imbue your son with the most important thing of all, a sense of his own importance. I ask you, do we really need more old Etonian politicians imbued with a sense of their own importance? Is this what this country needs? I urge you to support the motion. Nationalise Eton, consign it to the dustbin of institutions that have outlived their usefulness, and return Eton to the community whence it came. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. We will now move to our first speaker for side opposition, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan O'Neill is the editor of Spiked. He's also a columnist for Penthouse and a writer for The Sun and The Spectator. He's host of The Brendan O'Neill Show, a fortnightly podcast. Thank you, Brendan. You may take the floor.
Thank you very much. People who want to nationalise private schools, which pretty much means people who want to abolish private schools, let's be honest, these people tend to fall into one of two camps. The first camp is made up of people who went to private school and had a bad experience. You see these people on TV all the time. They all have columns in the Guardian newspaper. They talk endlessly about what a horrible experience they had. You know, the time they had their head flushed down the toilet, how hard they struggled with their Greek homework, how much they missed mummy and daddy and nanny if they went to a boarding school. And, you know, of course, these people have no idea how ludicrous they sound to the rest of the population, to the 93% of us, and I'm in that 93%, who went to state school and who could only have dreamed of having the educational standards that these experts in self-pity enjoyed. They sound a bit like Meghan Markle, who was in Malawi a couple of weeks ago, the fifth poorest country on earth, from where she gave an interview about how hard her life was. And I think, you know, there is little in this world that is more nauseating than the self-regard and the self-sorrow of privileged people. So I think to that first camp, which is opposed to private schools and essentially wants to abolish private schools, we should say the same thing that we would say to Meghan Markle. Poor little princess. There is not a violin in the world small enough for us to express the sadness we feel for your hard life of privilege that you have experienced up until now. And then there is the second camp of people who want to nationalise/abolish private schools like Eton and Harrow and so on. This second camp consists of what we might call the bitter middle classes. And these people are even worse. These are the people who didn't quite get to private school, and have never gotten over that fact. These are the kind of people who populate the Corbynista movement. The Corbynista movement is a thoroughly middle-class movement, a thoroughly ABC movement, and they agitate, of course, for the abolition of Eton and for the nationalisation of its buildings and its resources. There is a very strong whiff of social envy in this camp. Very few of them are driven by a principled opposition to private education. In fact, the Sutton Trust revealed recently that more than 30% of kids around the country, and it rises to more than 40% in London, now partake in private tuition. They get private tuition, extra tuition, tuition that their parents pay for in order to give them an advantage over the poorer kids in the state schools that they attend. A lot of these bitter middle classes who make up the anti-Eton, anti-Harrow, anti-private school Corbynista movement will be partaking in that form of private education. They will be paying for their kids.
Can you please wait for a mic to speak? Sorry.
Do the categories these people fall into make their arguments any less valid?
I'm coming on to that. It absolutely makes their arguments less valid. So if you will bide with me, you will discover why. So these people partake in private education. They pay for their children to have an unfair advantage over the poorer kids in the state school sector. So they are not driven by a principled opposition to private education. They're driven by something else. I think what we have, I think it's incredibly relevant. So speaking to this point and speaking to the general point, I think it's incredibly relevant that the two key camps who argue against private schools and argue for the nationalisation / abolition of private schools are either private school graduates who had a bad time or the bitter middle classes who didn't quite get there. I think that's incredibly relevant because what we have, on one side you have the sad-eyed private school graduate, and on the other side you have the not quite posh enough middle classes. That's incredibly relevant because what it speaks to is that the opposition to private schools today, the hostility to private schools, the desire to phase these schools out really expresses a kind of middle-class sense of exhaustion. It expresses the bourgeoisie's loss of faith in itself. It expresses a sense of bourgeois exhaustion with the ideas of excellence, standards, with all the things that Eton, for example, represents. I can assure you, you will never hear ordinary working class people complaining about private schools. The working class people I know never talk about Eton. You never hear coffee mornings of single mums. You never hear them talking about the problem of Eton and the problem of Harrow and what are we going to do about the private schools. You never hear Muslim community groups talking about the problem of private schools. You never hear people on a Friday night out in Kilburn talking about the problem of private schools. The only people who talk about the problem of private schools are the people who went or the people who almost went. Which one are you?
Can you please wait for a mic?
Are you one of those camps? So, do you come from Kilburn? Which one? No, that's the problem. Yes. Okay, fine. You've made... You've made a really telling assumption there. You've presumed that there's no one here who's from a working class background. I am. My father... No, there's no more points of information because I've got to finish my speech. Wrap it up, guys. I know you feel really aggrieved by what I'm saying. I'm from a working class background. My father was a builder. My mother was a housewife. They are Irish immigrants. I went to a state school. I went to a Catholic school. It was run by nuns. They were crazy. They were severe. They were nuts. So your presumption that there's no one here from a working class background is utterly wrong and fairly prejudiced because the person at this platform is from a working class background. And I'm here to tell you that the reason it's relevant that the people who are opposed to private schools tend to come from those bourgeois sections of society is because this movement against private schools is not a progressive movement. And what it misses is one key fact, which is that the crisis of social mobility in this country, and there is undoubtedly a crisis of social mobility in this country, the professions are dominated by people who went to private school. But that crisis of social mobility is not down to the existence of private schools. It's not down to the existence of Eton. It's not down to the existence of Harrow. It is down to the establishment's complete and utter loss of faith. I can't believe my speech is coming to an end. It's down to the establishment's complete and utter loss of faith in ordinary people and the denigration of general education to such an extent that is not really education at all. It is about bolstering kids' self-esteem. It is about treating kids like idiots. It is about indoctrinating children so that they think the right way. Education, as a term, comes from the Latin educere. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong because I didn't go to private school. Educare means to lead out, to draw out, to take you out of yourself. The problem with education today, state education, is that it focuses you on yourself, your self-esteem, your fragility, your weakness. This is where the crisis of social mobility comes from. The fact that millions of children in this nation are not being properly educated. To turn the attention to Eton and Harrow and the other private schools is a displacement activity of epic proportions, and it will make the crisis worse because to destroy the intellectual capital of a place like Eton by incorporating it into a state that doesn't believe in excellence will harm absolutely everyone in this country and not just the people who go to Eton. Thank you. Thank you. I missed that like 3/4 of my speech.
Thank you, Brendan.
But it's fine.
Before I open the debate to the floor, I'd just like to note the floor prizes for this week. So the first prize, floor speech prize, is a day course with the Cambridge art makers, and the runner-up is a session with Regina Ray Photography. I'd really encourage people who haven't spoken in debates or made floor speeches before to speak up. I promise you it's not as scary as it looks. So is there anyone who'd like to speak in proposition of the motion? Should we start with there?
Hi, I'm Joe. I should start with full disclosure. Some years ago, I was in a debating competition. My state school went to this regional debating competition, and we tried really hard. There were 75 schools there, only 3 went through. And at the end, despite our best efforts, we were told we'd been beaten by Eton A, Eton B, and Eton C. I've never forgiven it. My argument against Eton is not purely based on bitterness. I think it is unfair. I think it's not right that you should be able to pay for your child to have a better education, better social prospects, better economic prospects than another child. And it makes a mockery of the principle of education, because education should be the great leveller. It should make things more even. But until we level education itself, then our society will continue to look more like a climbing wall than a playing field. So for reasons of fairness, for reasons of justice, for reasons of social equality, I really hope we'll vote in favour of this motion.
Is there anyone who wishes to speak in opposition of the motion? Should we start over there at the back?
Well, I think it's my turn to start with a little disclosure in turn, because despite my voice, I went to a grammar school. But nevertheless, people want to talk in this debate about how people are paying for education and how education is a leveller. And I agree entirely, which is exactly why the private schools should continue, because 0.7% of the state's education budget is spent on students in private education, whereas that are 7% of students in private education, rising to 18% at sixth form. So it's the people who send their children to private schools who pay for everyone else and who don't take out of the pot themselves, which means that education for everyone else is being raised up by these people who are not taking out of the pot. And instead, therefore, of dragging down private institutions to the level of the state, we should use the money that they can provide to drag state education up so that it can be a great leveller without impinging on freedom of choice. Thank you.
Is there anyone who wishes to speak in abstention of the motion? How are you going to get down here? Could you come down to the microphone, please?
Perfectly honest, I'm not sure why all of you are here. There are 350 people in this room discussing the continued existence of one school. Now, I read this notion on the order paper and thought, why is this such a peculiarly British obsession, public schools, and especially Eton? So because I'm a historian, I did some research. So I went and found, within the Cambridge archives, the earliest reference to Eton that I could find. So in 1483, only 43 years after it was founded, a fellow from King's College wrote, new students coming from Eton were grossly neglected and ill-educated at Eton. Their education was poor, and their grammar was a mass of monkish doggerel. So evidently, this idea that it's always been a bastion of excellence isn't quite so well-founded after all. Thank you.
Now we'll move to the second speaker on side proposition. Sam O'Brien is studying HSPS at St John's. He won the opportunity to speak through open audition.
Now, I do admit it is going to be a little hard to follow. Going to follow an argument of such intense academic and intellectual rigour as that put forward by the opposition just. I did feel it would be a better idea to focus on the actual issues in this debate as opposed to tired right-wing cliches. However, I apparently was misunderstood the point of this. Education in Britain today, as opposed to merely being the tool through which young people learn and develop the skills that allow them to flourish, it is rather an instrument. It is an instrument through which this country's shameful and anachronistic class system is perpetuated. Britain today has amongst the worst social mobility anywhere in the developed world, with improvements having now been in stagnation for 4 years. Class privilege is at its most entrenched in this country as it has been for decades. And the link between schools like Eton and our private education system and the outright dominance of those from the very wealthiest backgrounds is inextricable. Despite constituting just 6.5% of our population, the privately educated constitute 65% of our nation's judges, just over half of our diplomats, just under half of our newspaper columnists, a third of our MPs, 60% of our prime ministers since the Second World War. It is a source, and so it goes on. It is a source of great shame that more of our nation's prime ministers have attended Eton than have attended a state school of any sort. Now, of course, the opposition will argue, and have argued in the past, that this is as a result of the failure of our state system. And I, as I hope everyone else does, wholeheartedly agree with the urgent need to reform and reinvigorate our state education sector. Without a doubt, this represents a necessary component in fixing the gulf in the quality of education that we have in this country. However, even with an outstanding state education system, we would still fail to overcome the undue privilege and advantages bestowed and enforced by the private school system. Why would this be the case? Surely, if the education received at state schools, as of schools like Eton, is of the same academic quality, the gap in grades no longer existent, then the whole purpose of private education, to give your child the most advantageous position possible, would become redundant. This, however, I fear would be a short-sighted understanding of the issue. Schools like Eton don't just afford privilege through the attainment of the highest grades or admission into the best universities, but through the immense social and cultural capital they bestow upon their pupils. At the top of our politics, in our media, in our financial sector, in so many of our most powerful occupations, a deep rot has manifested itself, in which success is based overwhelmingly on who you know as opposed to what you know. It acts as no surprise, therefore, given the immense social connections an individual can make at attending a private school, especially one such as Eton, to find out that even when state and privately educated pupils achieve the same grades, attend the same university, and apply for work in the same field, the privately educated will still on average earn more than their state-educated counterparts and are far more likely to be admitted into the most prestigious occupations. Anecdotally, the head of Channel 4 admitted recently, as part of a documentary about breaking into Britain's elites, that attaining work in broadcast media, for example, is centred around both intricate social connections and the presence of polish in an individual. More broadly speaking, this concept of polish, the inevitable quality one must apparently possess in order to gain work in Britain's elites, has become a thinly veiled way for this country's ruling class to justify their preferential treatment of the affluent and privately educated. Now, at this stage, it could well be argued that this is an issue for which the responsibility lies in broader society, at the feet of our institutions, and that the crisis of social mobility is not the fault of schools like Eton and our private education system. And I don't argue, and I hope neither would anyone else, that nationalising our private schools and places like Eton would in and of itself rectify the class inequalities that plague modern Britain. A vast array of reform and improvement, far beyond just education, is required to redress this inequality. However, given how private schools act so consistently and overwhelmingly as the feeder schools for power in Britain, given how they act as a breeding ground for class privilege and future connections, given that of our past 3 prime ministers, 2 of them attended not only Eton, but Eton at the same time, it seems impossible to overcome the British class system without removing the gilded training camps of the British elites. It is shameful that so many of our politicians, academics, journalists speak with such fervour about the wonders of meritocracy, about the... Yes, absolutely. University education has never served the purpose of fundamental primary education. It has always served the purpose of higher education, further education, education beyond that, which is essential to equip people with the skills people have in their everyday life. As a result, it's not part of the sort of comprehensive system which is in place in order to give people the skills that they that we have an education system for. So Oxford and Cambridge and many other elite universities have absolutely become the gilded training camps of the elite, but that is only because they have been allowed to be dominated by the elite as a consequence of the education system that precedes them, in large part also obviously due to huge institutional inequalities within the institutions themselves, which need to be redressed. Now, where was I? So it is shameful that so many of our politicians, academics, and journalists speak with such fervour about the wonders of meritocracy and about the need for upward social mobility, yet in the same breath and with often even greater fervour, defend the institutions whose very existence is a destructive blight on our only hope of achieving meaningful meritocracy in this country. Once again, we have heard frequently, not in this debate, but in more general, in defence of Eton and places like it, of the great benevolence of such institutions, of their generous bursaries, affording bright young people the chance to get an education of a far higher quality than what they would have hoped to gain in the state system. And for those lucky enough to be the recipient of such bursaries, the opportunities gained can be extraordinary. Yet such awards are rare. Only 6.3% of those in private education receive any form of financial support, with the total proportion of pupils in the UK being in the receipt of a bursary to attend a private school being less than 0.5%. This benevolence, therefore, rather than being the sign of the immense charitability of the private education system, the immense charitability of the private education system and the leg up they offer is nothing more than the world's tiniest life raft, thrown out into an ocean of millions, with only the very luckiest allowed to board. It is so meagre as to almost be an insult. This says nothing about the immense damage that allowing such an overwhelming proportion of our leaders to come from such a narrow pool of people, as enabled in large part of our education, does to our society. Incompetence and mediocrity is allowed to ascend to positions of immense influence. We see this in our politics, and our finance, in our business, and in our media. Subpar and mediocre individuals, sitting with educational records inflated far beyond their true abilities, hold undue amounts of influence in British society. Does anybody truly look at David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and Jacob Rees-Mogg and see before them the greatest minds of our country, whose rise to power has been predicated on raw skill, passion, and intellect? Or does one see a smug-faced clique of toffs, whose entire career and consequential power was launched from the privileged bastions of Eton and the subsequent connections attained there? To abolish private education, to allow young people of all backgrounds an equal start of life, to allow the leaders of our society to be drawn from the very widest pool, is to enhance the intellectual richness of our society, and is to improve the quality of our governance. Nationalising Eton and abolishing private education is far from a total solution to the deeply entrenched plague of class inequality. To achieve meritocracy and reinvigorate social mobility will be a difficult endeavour. However, if we were to look at the beating, rotting heart of the British class system and its dominance over this country, we would find Britain's private schools and we would find places like Eton. And should we wish, as I hope we all do, to end class inequality in Britain, then Eton and everywhere else like it must go. Thank you.
We'll now move to our second speaker inside opposition, Dr. Zoe Strimple. Dr. Strimple is a historian of gender, relationships, and feminism in modern Britain, and a flagship columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, where she writes on subjects ranging from identity politics to Love Island. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say I was tempted to actually do this speech on behalf of abstention, because I can't be the only one here who just thinks school sucks in general, whether it's state school, whether it's private school. Maybe I am. So, as a woman with no sons, and no relations who have ever been to, or I shouldn't think ever will go to Eton, I have very little skin in the posh boys' school game. More than that, boys in coattails make me feel a little bit weird. And when I hear of an Etonian, images of scary pit club types from my time here at Cambridge flit across my mind. And yet none of this is relevant. Eton should be let to thrive in its current independent form. It should be embraced as a force for good and excellence in this country, not subject to the legally suspect whims of people who want to repossess and redistribute its property. Eton's right to exist as an independent school is enshrined by the European Convention on Human Rights. But beyond this, what do the advocates of nationalisation think it would achieve? If it's simply a change of ownership, then it leaves the structures of inequality intact. If it's to dismantle or overhaul how Eton functions, then they clearly don't believe in the school at all. So why bother enshrining it as an organ of state? Since the motion leaves this murky, I will proceed by inferring what they really intend. I suspect that those in favor of this motion want to level the playing field. They maintain that state ownership would be an antidote to inequality of opportunity. However, far from doing away with the problem of the privileged few, state ownership could simply make it worse. Middle-class parents would be quick to maximize their advantages to get little Owen or Jeremy into Eton's state, endowing them with after-school tuition and cultural opportunities. Private schools today might be engines of privilege, to quote the historian David Kynaston, but their existence masks far deeper inequalities, such as parental aspirations, social connections, intellectual curiosity, and belief in education itself. Nationalising Eton would do nothing to reverse this. Take the example of France's École nationale d'administration, their Eton equivalent on steroids. The ENA, as it's called, were elite academies founded in 1945 precisely to promote social mixing and to give less privileged students the chance to ascend the highest ranks of government. At the latest count, 70% of the intake came from the upper classes, and Macron has promised to axe the schools for being too elitist. State control clearly does not fix inequality. At least the ENA is mixed, though only a third of the intake is women. That the left gets its boxer shorts in such a twist over Eton shines a light on a real inequality lurking behind all this stuff. It's all boys, boys, boys. Where is the campaign to hashtag abolish Wickham Abbey or hashtag abolish South Hampstead School for Girls? Missing, no doubt, because elite women's stranglehold on the chambers of power has been piffling compared to men's. Surely this shows that it's possible for thousands upon thousands of children to attend the most exclusive schools in the country and remain a mere footnote in arguments about power and privilege. Perhaps, therefore, it's not the school's fault after all. But I digress. Much criticism has been aimed at the idea of charitable status. Yet in Eton's case, it makes perfect sense. It has not been a license to hoard gold and cackle while the poor suffer and toil. Since 2009, the school has spent £67 million on financial aid and increased entirely free places from 27 to 90 pupils, and this number is rising steadily. The school recently launched the Orwell Award, which offers 12 or more free places each year to less privileged boys, including those on the edge of care. Through the free school program, Eton sponsored Holyport College in Maidenhead, Britain's first free boarding school for poorer kids who can't live at home. And thanks to increasing public scrutiny, Eton is part of an increasingly charitable sector. As well as the £420 million spent on financial aid in 2018 on widening access, granted a lot of that went to already quite well-to-do people, the sector has recently proposed a scheme to offer 10,000 free places per year to children from low-income families. These are not marginal or tokenistic measures. Hundreds of thousands of children will benefit within 20 years. And there are numerous partnerships between independent and state schools, such as Schools Together, Royal Springboard, I'm going to keep going, the UK's largest boarding school bursary charity, and the London Academy of Excellence. And now to the deeper and more troubling conceptual problem at the heart of this motion. As Robespierre and Stalin knew well, it's much easier to cry kill the rich than to set about the far more complex task of creating real opportunities for the poor. Likewise, those who insist that Eton in its current form bars the way to equality are not actually interested in boosting opportunity to a wider range of children. They are interested in crushing it across the board. Yet, like most other things in life, education is not a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. The more good schools there are out there, the better, not the other way round. Trashing schools with proven records of excellence will not boost standards across the sector. Trashing anything excellent has never in the history of the world made things better for anyone. Can it make things fairer? Yes, if by fair you mean worse. The weakness of this position is evident in the frequent hypocrisies of those who hold it. Seamus Milne, Corbyn's Marxist spin doctor and son of BBC Director General Alistair Milne, was so committed to the cause of the oppressed that he adopted a Palestinian accent and called himself Shams, an Arabic name, as an undergraduate at Balliol College, Oxford. A graduate of Winchester and Oxford, he ensured his own kids went to selective grammars and on to Oxbridge too. Nothing but the worst for everyone else's kids, nothing but the best for his. Shami Chakrabarti, a prominent critic of selective education, also sends her kids to an £18,000 per year independent school, and there are plenty of other similar examples. It's true that until recently, old boys, and particularly old Etonians, dominated politics and power in this country, and the indignation on that score is justified. But it's aimed at an already outmoded caricature. Sorry. Yeah.
Just shout.
That's the definition of hypocrisy. So no, I don't think that does. I think it. I've got to keep going. I'm sorry, but thank you. Right. So indignation on the score of old Etonians dominating power is justified, but it's aimed at an already outmoded caricature. What is emerging is an institution that already produces leavers very different from Bojo or Cameron. Hassan Patel, 16, is a boy from a council estate in East London whose parents came from, quote, abject poverty in India. He addressed the Labour Party conference when he was just 15. When he won a £76,000 scholarship to attend Eton for sixth form last year, okay, I better speed up here, he was thrilled and his parents were wild with joy. His fellow Labour Party members were less so. Patel tweeted after winning the place that I'm being called a traitor, hypocrite, selfish champagne socialist for accepting a scholarship to Eton College. I've worked so hard for this and you're not going to put me down. Instead of attacking me, why aren't you talking about inequalities in the education system? His parents were more at ease, expressing their delight in their son's achievement. I never thought when I left India in 1972 that my son would end up going to the same school that the English royalty have been to, said his beaming father. We want him to go to Oxford or Cambridge. Being at Eton will give him a very good chance. Indeed, or should we dismiss that response as the reaction of people who simply didn't know better? People also undervalue Eton as a cultural force, and I'm very much close to the end. In Robert Verkake's very funny, did I get that right? The pronunciation? Okay. Very funny book, Alan Bennett is quoted recalling the public school louts of his Cambridge days, while others reveal their horror of all the talk of Tarquin and Humphrey's gap years. If there's truth in this, there's also a painful narrowness. Eton has never produced only one type. The great liberal prime ministers were Etonians, like Gladstone and Rosebery, who married the Jewish heiress Hannah Rothschild. More recently are the founders of Amnesty International and Save the Children. And between the painful pit club types, Eton has always fostered ideological diversity, producing important anti-establishment left-wingers such as George Orwell, who's already been mentioned, and Guy Burgess. plus some of the best comedians, actors, and novelists in the world, from Aldous Huxley and Ian Fleming to Eddie Redmayne and Evo Graham. The school's resources to nurture such talents are second to none, and calling for its destruction is to miss its vital role in fields far beyond Whitehall and Westminster. To conclude, in this case, nationalising Eton can only diminish it. Rubbishing the best institutions, those with the best brains, teachers, and facilities, just rubbishes everything, which is why those keen on improving British educational opportunity should be crying out for more, not fewer Etons, Etons that are rich, independent, diverse, and truly charitable. Thank you.
We will now move to our second round of floor speeches. Again, I really encourage and recommend anyone who hasn't made a floor speech before to try it out. Again, it's really not as scary as it looks. So does anyone want to make a speech on side proposition of the motion? Should we go for over there?
I had what many would call the terrible misfortune of going to a state school in Indiana, where we had a social studies teacher who liked to tell the female students who didn't like Sarah Palin that they were just jealous of her body. I now supervise 50-plus HSPS students at Cambridge, and I don't actually observe any great strength on the part of the private school students. They're not better than the state school students. So on what basis do we argue that the private schools are actually good? Well, they deliver good A-level results, and as a result, there are a lot of them here. But they don't write better essays. So what's the standard we're using to judge this on? I'm here, I'm teaching them, and I went to a terrible school.
Does anyone want to speak on side opposition of the motion? Should we go for there at the back?
I'm new and I have my notes, so I'm sorry. From what I've heard here, the main argument on both sides is about class inequality. I don't think that nationalising private schools, including Eton, would have very much impact on class equality at all. If these schools were nationalised, simply certain state schools would be better funded than others, and therefore more popular with members of the upper class. It would be private schools by another name. What is really needed is reform of state school education and universal examinations. In my mind, the most effective way to do that would not be to nationalise Eton. So, don't go for it.
Would anyone like to speak in abstention of the motion? Start with there. Yeah.
So it strikes me as kind of almost a non-issue, really. I mean, we've already heard sort of people mention about how, you know, if Eton or any other private school was nationalised, people with the money would get hire private tutors, or they'd be able to take their children to Pompeii and other sort of cultural sites. But it strikes me as it kind of, deflecting the issue down the line. But I think the problem isn't so much the private schools, it's issues with funding of state schools. Why can't we make state schools more competitive? Like, surely that would be sort of more productive than simply just abolishing private schools. That wouldn't fix the issues on the state school side. So I say it's a non-issue, really. It's more, abstain.
And before I move to the next round of speeches, I'd just like to remind everyone who's made a floor speech that you're invited to drinks in the bar with the speakers afterwards. So congratulations, you've now just won a free glass of wine, basically. Okay, so now for the last speaker on side proposition, Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens is a journalist, author, and occasional broadcaster. He's currently a columnist for the Mail on Sunday, and before this he was a reporter and correspondent, including in Moscow and Washington in the early 1990s. Peter, you may take the floor.
I try to work out which of the social, moral, mental cripples or bladders of malice Brendan was trying to describe as the supporters of this motion. I have every reason myself to have bitter resentments against the private education system. Apart from anything else, I have spent over the past 30 years the gross domestic product of Uruguay on sending children to private schools. And if I hadn't done so, I could have bought a yacht, a Bentley, and a private train. And anybody would resent that. I also underwent private education in the years when it was considerably more barbaric than it is now. And I attended more than one of these St. Custard's type preparatory schools, a peculiar institution which is not given enough attention in these debates, where thrashings and indeed indecent assault were not unknown. And I could say that it didn't do me any harm, because none of you would believe me if I said that. But it didn't. And it also gave me a very useful experience of both the moral and physical characteristics of totalitarianism, both the extraordinarily oppressive nature of the regimes which I endured, and the appalling food. So when I went to live in Moscow in 1990, I think I could say that my private education had suited me very well for the experiences I then underwent, and I think probably without it I might not have been able to stand it. So there are things to be said in favor of it and things to be said against it, but I think we have to be clear here what the proposition is. And one thing which I've insisted on since I engaged myself on this side is that we're not talking about the abolition of Eton at all. We're talking about the nationalization of it, and to be absolutely correct, we're talking about the renationalization of it, because if you look at the history of Eton, which I have to point out here is actually a cheap knockoff of Winchester, if you look at the history of Eton, it was founded by the blessed King Henry VI, the man often derided as weak and sometimes mad, but who seems to have left in his educational legacy a more valuable trace of himself than many other English monarchs. It was founded by Henry VI, as was Winchester, and as indeed were some of the other original public schools, for the education of the poor, and for the education of poor scholars for the benefit of the country, and for the benefit of themselves as well. And this was a noble, it seems to me, enterprise. And what's happened to Eton and Winchester since, and to many, many other private schools, is that this purpose has been almost entirely forgotten. And I think we should remember it. And people say, well, what about nationalization? Nationalization will surely damage anything on which it is inflicted. To which I would reply, well, look what happened when they denationalized the railways. They got considerably worse. There is a very strong argument for renationalizing them, which I could make here tonight, but it's not the subject under discussion. There is no necessity which says that state control will make something worse. And there are many, many arguments, particularly which one could apply to important institutions such as the armed forces, where national control has been vital. So let us put out of our minds any idea that this is some kind of Bolshevik extirpation of private schools on the grounds of silly Jacobin rage against privilege, because it isn't. What we actually have here is a very serious and important question about how we approach the education of children in this country. Now, people are always saying, you get it from both Conservative and Labour politicians in this country, that the private schools should do more to help the poor and to help children who can't go to them. And these are the very people whose parties were involved in the abolition of exactly such a system. You're all far too young to know this, but in the 1960s, when I was serving my term at the Lees School, Cambridge, where I got time off for bad behavior, there existed in this country a system known as, I think I may have some cough sweets somewhere, and I will throw them at you if you carry. There was a system known as the Direct Grant School. Yes? No, indeed, I accept you, Your Honour. But most of you don't know that there were institutions called direct grant schools. What these were, they were mainly private schools, but they took in, on the basis of a direct grant from the government, very, very large numbers of pupils who could not conceivably have afforded to go there. One example which has always particularly moved me is that of the Latimer Upper School, where Alan Rickman, a great actor who many of you will have seen on the screen, went to school. Now, Alan Rickman, some of you may be surprised to learn, was the son of a painter and decorator. He had no privileged class background at all. When he attended Latimer Upper School, I think 90% of its pupils were actually attending under the direct grant and came from poor homes. This was the system which encompassed very large numbers of schools in most major cities in this country, and it worked completely in step with the other forgotten education system in this country, of which traces, misleading traces still survive, called the grammar schools. These were selective state schools. There were about 1,300 of them in England and Wales, and another few hundred in Scotland, and of course there are still some in Northern Ireland. What these schools did was that they opened the doors of education to anybody who could actually show that they were capable of benefiting from that education. And I will point out to you that in the Gurney-Dixon report of 1954, it was disclosed that 66% of the pupils at these schools came from working class backgrounds. They were the best schools in the country. They were better than the public schools. They were, during the 1960s and 1950s, storming Oxford and Cambridge, but they were pushing public school pupils out of Oxford and Cambridge with no special provision, no outreach, no lowering of standards, no attempt to say, oh, well, because you went to a grammar school, we'll give you special treatment at the interview. They got in on their genuine merits. Working class children from poor backgrounds in their thousands, so that by 1966, Oxford was already taking almost a majority of pupils from state schools, as I say, with no proper provision. All these forgotten things need, it seems to me, to be revived. It is absolutely true. And anybody who loves this country, be he conservative or socialist, has to concede that there is a shocking absence of social mobility in this country. Education is not merely bought in this country by the paying of school fees. It is bought by the buying of houses in the catchment areas of the better comprehensives, an enormous system of straightforward social advantage given to the rich. It is bought by the hiring of private tutors by the thousand, by the parents of pupils at state schools who can afford it, leaving behind those who cannot have it. It is grotesquely unequal. And the answer to it needs to be found pretty soon, before this country becomes so hopelessly divided in matters of class that there is no going back. And one very straightforward answer to it is this, is to go back to the idea of Henry VI and say what we should be concerned about is finding the best people, the best daughters and sons of this country, and educating them to the best of their ability, finding out their talents, and using them to the maximum so that this country can once again actually be the prosperous, intellectually vibrant country in which there was very much less class distinction than there is now, which existed in my teens and 20s, and which was abolished by idiots in the 1960s and 1970s. And if in return for this provision, Eton College has to go back to being what it was originally supposed to be, a school where children were allowed in because they were bright and could therefore be given the best education which money could provide, then what would be wrong with that? And if state control was necessary to achieve this, what would be wrong with that? As I say, no conservative, no socialist can argue practically against this as a method of achieving what we need as a country. And yet, this proposition features in the manifesto of no political party and is argued by nobody. And I have to ask you tonight to wonder in your future years, when you have some influence over the future of the country in which you live, to wonder why it is that this intelligent, simple, straightforward, fair idea is not universally adopted. You have the chance to do it. I hope you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And finally, closing the case for side opposition, the Right Honourable Stephen Dorrell. Stephen Dorrell was a Conservative Member of Parliament from 1979 until 2015, holding numerous offices including Secretary of State for Health and Shadow Secretary of State for Education and Employment. Thank you, Stephen. You may take the floor.
Madam President, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. As you said, 36 years a Tory MP, 49 years a member of the Tory party, now a proud Liberal Democrat. I'll leave you to imagine why that might be. I begin by declaring a similar interest to the interest that Peter declared. That is that I myself went to a private school, my family went to a private school, and I played a significant part in the management of a private school for a number of years. So I am committed to the role of the private sector in a properly mixed education system. And I was interested in Peter's argument because I agreed with very much of it. What I didn't understand was how it constituted an argument for nationalising Eton, or come to that, any other private school. Because just reflect for a second what nationalisation means in the Britain of 2019. It means that the management of these schools should be the responsibility of Boris Johnson. So if you go out and vote aye to this motion, you're regarding Boris Johnson as a safe trustee of the legacy of King Henry VI. I suggest you should reflect deeply on that proposition before you cast your vote in the direction that Peter suggests. I give way, of course.
Do you seriously suggest that any government containing or led by Mr. Johnson could conceivably adopt this policy?
It's an interesting speculation this evening whether a government led by Mr. Boris Johnson is capable of adopting any policy on anything. It is, for those of his supporters in the room, if there are any, a cause of celebration that tonight, for the first night since he became Prime Minister, he won a vote in the House of Commons. I'm pleased to say he then went on to lose the second vote in the House of Commons this evening. But, Madam President, I wanted to offer you congratulations for proposing a motion or tabling a motion this evening, which is very much in the spirit of the age in which we live. Because the proposition that in our complex social issues, facing our complex social issues, the answer is to nationalise Eton, frankly ranks with get Brexit done or make America great again. Simple slogans that don't address the issues that we all know we face our country. Of course. Simple and clear, and at least addressing the issue of the day. The issue in public policy, I think, so often, is to identify what is the problem you're trying to solve. And that's the issue that underlay Peter's speech. He was seeking to develop a policy to develop greater social mobility, greater opportunity for children from a wide range of social backgrounds, break down some of the barriers that face people from different backgrounds. And he linked that proposition to the idea that the real thing that we have to do to address those issues is to change the ownership of Eton College. Now, we face many issues as a country, but two things, it seems to me, are not key issues in 2019. The first, I don't think it's a key issue to change the management of Eton, or come to that, the great majority of other independent schools, because I don't think it's any longer true, as it was apparently in 1483, that Eton produced scholars expert in clerical gibberish. I think Eton, part of the issue why we're discussing Eton, is that it's recognized to be a good school. So if it's a good school, why are we addressing the issue of ownership of Eton? Surely we should address the real issue, which several speakers, actually on both sides of this argument, have addressed this evening, which is nothing to do with who owns it. The issue is around access to the quality of education which is provided by Eton and a wide range of other independent schools. Brendan quite rightly said, we're sometimes in this country, we are frightened of the concept of the pursuit of excellence. And one of the reasons I'm in favour of varied provision of education is to encourage people to find new ways to develop new ideas for the delivery of excellent education that responds to the needs of today's generation of people attending school. The very worst way of addressing that issue, in my mind, is to create a monopoly. I'm not in favor, I don't hold any particular brief that says state ownership is always wrong. I was health secretary. I've been involved in the health service for most of my adult life. I'm strongly in favor of the state having a role. What I'm not in favor of is the state having an uncontested role. And that's the path down which I believe we would be headed if we adopted the policy of nationalising Eton. Let us, for goodness sake, recognise that there are good schools in the state sector, there are good schools in the private sector. We should celebrate the good schools and recognise the problem is, firstly, there aren't enough good schools, and secondly, that often, in particular in the private sector, there is a problem about equitable access to those good schools. So let public policy address head-on the question that it's trying to solve, rather than adopting a proxy which sounds good as a political soundbite, but doesn't deliver the outcome that which we regard as motivation.
But if private schools were to allow this small total number of state-educated students into them, surely what they're doing is throwing a crumb to attempt to make a show of redressing a system of inequality that they are entirely a part of.
Well, if with respect, it's your language, not mine, that talks about a token number of a few pupils going into a varied education sector. I am strongly in favour of programmes, partly through the private sector and partly through their relationship with the state sector. In other words, a genuine mixed economy that doesn't result, as you rightly say, in a few token beneficiaries, but engages those organisations, those institutions, in the delivery of a properly diverse education sector. So as my time is up, Madam President, as we reflect with great respect on your Trumpian motion, could I suggest that we also reflect on the closing words of Sam, who was the undergraduate proposing this motion. He concluded with a strong call for equality, which always sounds good. But is equality what matters, or is opportunity what really matters? Opportunity for all. Are we to embrace equality at whatever level, or are we to embrace opportunity for all? I, for one, am strongly on the side of opportunity for all.
Funnily enough, wasn't even my motion. But as we wrap up the debate tonight, I have a couple of thanks to make. Firstly, thank you always to our speakers for coming here and making such a politically pertinent debate possible tonight. Thank you to our AV staff for working so hard to keep the AV running, and to the stewards and committee who have helped make this event possible. Thank you to you, the audience, for coming and making the debate lively. And, well, thank you to the committee who organized this, in terms of Luke in particular. In terms of other events this week, so We start tomorrow with Alan Leong, who will be speaking at 6 o'clock. He is a Hong Kong political activist. At 7 o'clock, we also have Now, who's a British Breakthrough Act. On Thursday, we'll be having our debate on globalization, and on Friday, we'll be having Ken Costa at 7 p.m. On Saturday, we'll be having a talk with Scarlett Curtis in conversation with Amika George, and next Tuesday, we have at 5 p.m. Professor Richard Evans. So in terms of voting, here at the Cambridge Union, we vote with our feet. So if you wish to vote on side proposition, please walk through the door on the right. If you wish to vote inside opposition, please walk through the door on the left. This applies also to those up in the balcony. Results will be announced later in the bar, and I hope you enjoyed this evening. Thank you.